Good morning, everyone.
Good morning, everyone. Good afternoon. So we're going to have three speakers today. We have Siarhei, Biareishyk, right, from the Center of Literary and Cultural Research, and then also this year, the University of Pennsylvania, and then Haro, right, from CUNY, City University of New York, and finally in London, David Murphy. So I guess half an hour for each speaker, and then we'll open the floor for questions. Okay?
So in what follows, my talk will draw attention to a certain dominant ideological modality in reproduction of capital inherent in its very material practices. So I will try to show how Marx's own analysis takes account of this logical modality not in opposition to history, but as a concrete understanding of history. From this I will gesture towards the concept of logical time as a way of thinking contingent and systematic violence and reproduction of capitalism. And I think this is also a way to such phenomena as affective exploitation that Irina foregrounded, for example, last time. And I will think of it in terms of the tension between logical and historical times in their abstract and concrete configurations. And having listened to these talks in the past few days, I'm starting to realize that my talk is also a certain response to understanding why it appears that there is no alternative. And the question is whether indeed this appearance is, we should understand it in the Hegelian sense or not. So to define my terms, I'm working with four terms: logical, historical, abstract, and concrete. Quote Marx, the concrete is concrete because it is the concentration of many determinations, hence unity of the diverse. So just because this table is in front of us and is tangible does not mean that this is concrete. Concrete is understanding something within its relation in the capitalist mode of production. So this means that concrete is not given to us immediately. It is rather an outcome of theoretical practice. Abstract is an individual entity, such as commodity or society, extracted from its many determinations. For example, the ideological and apologetic bits of the bourgeois economists, Marx shows, are affected into their abstract nature, whereas Marx's intervention consists in treating the social mode of the capitalist mode of production through its relational determination, that is, concretely. In his 1857 introduction, Marx argues, quote, the aim of the classical political economists is to present production as distinct from distribution, as encased in eternal natural laws independent of history, and which opportunity bourgeois relations are then quietly smuggled in as the inviolable natural laws on which society in the abstract is founded. Abstraction of the bourgeois economists, then, consists in the extraction of society from its history. This suggests that concrete analysis of society is inextricable from its historical analysis. So what I'm saying here now is quite banal, quite easy, but this gets really complicated once we start thinking about what is historical means in relation to concrete. So in the critique of political economy, the abstraction that smuggles its ideological underpinnings must be put into relations made concrete by showing the mutual determinations of the spheres of production, distribution, consumption, etc. This is possible, I think, from the standpoint of reproduction. As Etienne Balibat aptly notes, the analysis of reproduction shows that the mode of production determines mode of circulation, distribution, and consumption at so many moments of opportunity. It destroys the appearance of the exchange of equivalent, and it dissolves the appearance of a free contract between the worker and the capitalist. Indeed, as Althusser argues, quote, a mode of production subsists only insofar as the reproduction of the conditions of production is ensured. In a sense, then, although diachronically, in linear time, production precedes reproduction, logically, production already presupposes reproduction. It is already an effect of reproduction. So, if concrete analysis of capitalist society must think together these different spheres, then it must think so from the standpoint of reproduction, and this entails this logical modality of thought. So we have to ask, what is the relation between logical and historical, considered concretely? And here I will draw on the thought of Evan Ilyenkov, whom Kostas quoted yesterday, to my surprise. And Ilyenkov, many of you know, is a great Marxist from 1960s from the Soviet Union. Ilyenkov writes, for a materialist, the logical is the conceptualization of historical. Or more emphatically, quote, the logical is nothing other than the historical correctly conceptualized. This assertion appears all the more paradoxical in view of Marx's own thematization of his mode of conceptual, that is to say logical, exposition as opposed to the historical genesis of economic phenomena. In his 1857 introduction, Marx famously writes, quote, it would be therefore infeasible and wrong to let the economic categories follow one another in the same sequence as that in which they were historically decisive. Their sequence is determined rather by their relation to one another in modern bourgeois society, which is precisely the opposite of that which seems to be their natural order or which corresponds to historical development. And I think it is clear here that what Marx means by natural or historical development in this case is some kind of biological or natural time, and this is important. Or diachronic, what they call diachronic time. Marx continues, the point is not the historic position of the economic relations and the successions of different forms of society, even less it is their sequence in the idea, rather, Marx writes, their order within modern bourgeois society. So in what sense can Marx's conceptual analysis therefore be called historical and concrete? And to what extent can one justify Ilyenkov's claim that the logical is nothing other than the historical? In order to grasp this claim, I think one must reconfigure our notion of historical itself. First and foremost, shifting it away from understanding of historical as linear diachronic unfolding of events between past, present, and future. Rather, the historical that is coincidence with the logical, as Ilyenkov argues, quote, is only reviewed through the logical movement of thought itself. This is because abstraction that is characteristic of thought is produced in the very material practices of subjects in the capitalist mode of production, such as practices of exchange. This dynamic, I would argue, constitutes the condition of possibility of materialist thought that is coincidence of logical and historical. Marx's development of commodity form, and especially its apotheosis in his theorization of commodity fetishism, demonstrates that the commodity form entails both reproduction of social relations and the formal categories for their conceptualization. Alfred von Rettet, a lesser-known figure of the Frankfurt School, shows the systematic relation between the abstractions engendered in commodity form and theoretical thought. Quote, the formal analysis of the commodity holds the key not only to the critique of political economy, but also to the historical explanation of the abstract conceptual mode of thinking. Von Rettet's argument goes even further to suggest that the kind of abstraction thought arrives at was already effective in the dynamics of the market itself. For example, in exchange under capitalism, the qualitative aspect of labor that produced commodities, so labor, different labor produced this bottle than this watch, is suspended by quantitative determination of value. Both of these commodities can be expressed in terms of value, which signals the exchange of heterogeneous types of private labor as abstract human labor. Marx points out, quote, if I state that coats or boots stand in relation to linen because the latter is the universal incarnation of abstract human labor, absurdity of the statement is self-evident. One can say it is absurd from abstract empiricist viewpoint. Marx continues, quote, nevertheless, when the producers of coats and boots bring these commodities into relation with linen or with gold or silver, universal equivalent, the relation between their own private labors and the collective labor of society appears to them in exactly this absurd form. Logically, however, in the explication of commodity form, this absurd form proves quite reasonable if considered in the capitalist mode of production, that is to say, concrete. Though they may arise in mystified or fetishized form, Marx points out, these are, quote, forms of thought which are socially valid and therefore objective. So, the real abstraction, then, as von Rettet calls it, is at work in the material practices of capitalist agents as bearers, of these abstractions. Irina Cardella pushes this insight to the limit. Quote, The conclusion deriving from commodity fetishism is that the structures of thought coincide with those of external or objective reality. The structures of thought coincide with those of being. So we must, but we have to ask what is the mode of this coincidence. Or in other words, well, the materialist theoretical practice of course maintains that the category of thought or the logical is not outside of being. Does this also mean that material conditions themselves entail a logical modality independent of the subjectivity of its agents? So in fact, I would argue that Marx shows that in the very material practices in the social relations in the capitalist mode of production, the logical modality dominates the linear diachronic unfolding of events. And by logical here I mean, to give a famous example, there is father and son. Of course, in the diachronic time, father is older, father comes first and then comes the son, but logically son is what makes the father. Without the son there is no parent, and they are simultaneous. So this is the expression of the logical relation. So it is my sense that in the social relations under capitalist mode of production, it is the logical that dominates the diachronic unfolding in social practices. So for instance, the production of value presupposes an encounter of a free worker in double sense, free of all commodities and free to sell his or her labor power, and the capitalist owner of input production. And only after the consummation of the contract of the selling of labor power as a commodity for the use of capitalists for a certain amount of time, only after this fact can it be said that the worker belongs to capital, until the worker is once again released from the contract. At the same time, however, because the value of labor power is determined by the minimum means of subsistence of the worker, at the end of each abstract cycle, the worker emerges again as free in double sense of this word. So capitalist production thus, quote Marx, incessantly forces the worker to sell his labor power in order to live. In assuming this standpoint of reproduction, thus, Marx shows that in concrete understanding of social relations, well, the worker already belongs to capital before he has sold himself to the capitalist, emphasizing this systematic exploitation. Well, the bondage of the worker to capital, in other words, in diachronic time, presupposes that the worker first sells his labor power. In truth, the worker always already, logically, belongs to capital due to its incessant process of reproduction and social relations immanent in its eternal laws and material practices. So I would like to call this phenomenon precisely the dominance of logical over diachronic time, which incidentally, as we see here, manifests itself materially in the dominance of capital over labor. So most significantly, this dominance of the logical is marked by the fact that the surplus value pre-exists the very production of commodity that is supposed to be the cost of the surplus value by selling it. I can make this claim because when, quote, useful things are produced for the purposes of being exchanged, their value, which does not diachronically pre-exist the production, have, quote, already to be taken into consideration during production. Marx, of course. But Marx simply formulates this dynamic as follows, quote, surplus value is, in fact, the condition of value, not the other way around, since there is no reproduction of the value of the means of production by living labor unless new surplus value is produced. In this sense, the revenant appetite of accumulation is always already inscribed in the process of the expenditure of labor power. So, perhaps parenthetically, we can make the following argument. The reproduction of capitalism is not only the reproduction of capital relation between the wage labor on the one hand and the capitalist on the other hand, but the reproduction of its logical relation. So I will rephrase Althusser here to say that the driving force behind capitalism then is the reproduction of the logical social relation of exploitation by means of its dominance over the chronic linear time of production. So to pose the question of an alternative or resistance, one must pose the question about the possibility of reconfiguring this logical relation or interfering in the reproduction of this logical relation. And I think this tendency of dominance of the logical, which is characterized by simultaneity of some sort, is especially evident today with the capital's expansion and acceleration, where the finance technologies ever more reduce the significance of the linear historical time to in it. But this capacity, of course, was ever already present in the constitution of capitalist mode of production. As Marx says, quote, events which take place outside the sphere of circulation in the interval between buying and selling do not affect the form of this movement. Okay, I quote again, this is important. Events which take place outside the sphere of circulation in the interval between buying and selling do not affect the form of this movement. And to foreshadow what I'm saying, this movement, buying and selling, is simultaneous, but Marx marks them as 2 points. This is what I will later call logical time. There's some kind of a gap. What happens is in this gap does not matter to the form of movement, but this gap allows something like state violence or racism that is not implied by the logic of capital, but which logic of capital allows to happen. So this we will talk about later. And this phenomenon, the phenomenon of the credit system lays bare exactly this dynamic, where one assumes the selling, as Karatani puts it, quote, ideally in advance. Karatani stresses the asymmetry of exchange in the capitalist mode of production. While money as universal equivalent is universally exchangeable, there is no guarantee that one can exchange the produced commodity for money, something that signals this temporal delay, again, of money operation. Credit, in effect, defers selling, thus covering up the asymmetry of exchange in logical simultaneity. As Karatani writes, quote, because of the nature of credit, it appears as if the sale were already made. In this sense, quote, the self-movement of capital occurs because of its desperate need to postpone the settlement of accounts indefinitely. Needless to say, this permanent deferral in the reproduction of capital signals also a possibility of crisis. Once you sell too many mortgages and time to settle accounts comes and you cannot do it, this simultaneity, logical simultaneity of capital blows up, and what returns is the repressed diachronic time where violence can take place, where banks can be bailed out, and you know the rest. But we already in the credit system see that there is some kind of temporality in the logical. So my question is how we conceptualize. But this erasure of diachronic time does not only happen at any given present moment in capital's reproduction, but as Marx's analysis shows, capital has a capacity to erase its own history or its historical becoming. Marx argues, quote, as soon as capital has become capital as such, it creates its own presuppositions. Voraussetzungen. These presuppositions, which originally appeared as conditions, conditions of its becoming. Once again, these presuppositions, which originally appeared as conditions of its becoming, and hence could not spring from its action as capital, now appear as a result of its own realization, reality as posited by it, not as conditions of its rising, but as results of its being. So this procedure, according to Marx, gives form to the thought practice by bourgeois economists who quote regard capitalism eternal and natural, that is saying not historical form of production, a form of thought that quote attempts at the same time to legitimize it again by formulating the conditions of its becoming as the conditions of its contemporary realization. The fact that capital reproduces its own conditions as presuppositions of its existence gives the appearance of the eternity of capital because it perpetually creates its own beginning and thus appears to have no origin in diachronic linear time. And again, this is all speaks to what we keep addressing, this mantra, there is no alternative. Capitalism thus incorporates, perhaps in a sense of outcome, its history in the movement of its own unceasing realization. As Marx says, quote, these external presuppositions, the external conditions of the means of production, but also the existence of classes, of free laborers and forms of domination and so on, will now appear as moments of the motion of capital itself. So it has itself, regardless how they may arise historically, preposited them as its own moments. Nonetheless, the dominance of the logical modality on the historical scale of capital's becoming gives rise to linear diachronic narratives of capital's genesis in bourgeois economics. Of course, Marx summarizes such narratives. You know this passage all very well. It says, long time ago, there were two sorts of people. One worked hard, the other were rascals. Some saved, the other spent, and now some have to sell their skins and the other have the wealth. You know this story. So this, for Marx, recall, is abstraction of history. Although this is a narrative in diachronic time, this is precisely what he means by abstraction. The pre-capitalist categories of wealth and accumulations are projected onto capitalist mode of production. Marx quips, quote, in themselves, and this is important, in themselves, money and commodities are no more capital than the means of production and subsistence are. They need to be transformed into capital. That is, these categories gain their significance for Marx's analysis only when they consider in relation and in the context of capitalist mode of production, relations that both produce and reproduce the encounter of free worker and the owner of means of production. Only under these relations, and not prior to them, can the history of capital be understood concretely. So the linear historical explanation remains a myth, an abstraction from the kind of relations constitutive of the capitalist mode of production. So here we see the indication of Igenka's claim that logical is nothing other than historical. The logical analysis of capital and its categories, that is also the concrete historical analysis, thus, as Marx puts it, must be understood, quote, by their relation to one another in modern bourgeois society, which is precisely the opposite of that, which seems to be their natural order. That is what appears to be diachronic. So to give a quick example, considered from concrete historical viewpoints, such categories as rent or merchant capital can only be understood after the concept of surplus value. If one affirms the primacy of history, this claim appears paradoxical. How is it possible that from the concrete historical viewpoint, ground rent or merchant capital should be understood as forms succeeding surplus value, although in time, as we know, ground rent and merchant capital appeared before capital, before surplus value. This is because in its capacity to turn its own preconditions into its effects, capitalism also changes the determination of these categories. More precisely, in its reproduction, capital puts the remnants of the pre-capitalist mode of production, which constitute its historical conditions, into new relations. In other words, in the theoretical analysis that remains concrete, surplus value must be understood prior to the concept of ground rent, even though it appears later in time. Yet this mode of analysis should not be mistaken for a logical projection of the historical and cultural. Rather, the conception shifts the understanding of history away from its ideological and often teleological understanding as linear and diachronic. As Ilya puts it, quote, the place and the role of given categories is thus not dictated by the logical considerations, but by the very character of their historical process. So, I think that the task or the challenge for the Marxist and materialist thought is not to produce alternative genealogies of capital to show arbitrariness or contingence of capital or what have you, as an alternative to its natural appearance. The task is rather to give a stronger account of this logical dimension inherent in the very material practices of capitalism's reproduction. At the same time, the challenge to Marxist theory is to do so without losing sight of the concrete material forces in contemporary conjunction. So, that is to say, the task is to foreground the logical dimension in the reproduction of capital in order to account for its crisis, for its particular modes of domination and violence that take place supposedly beyond the logical domain. So to this end, I want to tentatively and very experimentally suggest to introduce Lacan's notion of logical time, because what I have been describing as logical until now is perhaps abstract logical. We need to make it concrete logical. To cite the entry from the Dictionary of Lacanian Psychoanalysis, quote, Lacan undermines the pretensions of logic to timelessness and eternity by showing how certain logical calculations include an inescapable reference to temporality. So this temporality of logical dimension still cannot be understood through linear or diachronic time, but entails what Lacan calls suspensive scansions that give order of temporal instances within the logical movements. To recall the logic of credit that I explained before. Though the institution of credit covers up the asymmetry between buying and selling, giving appearance of as if the selling was already taking place, indicating some kind of simultaneity. These two are different moments in logical time, I would say. So the crisis occurs precisely when the time of settling of accounts comes, when the movement between moments in logical time is somehow short-circuited, shattering the apparent simultaneity of the operation of buying and selling. So my conjecture here is that conceptualizing the logical modality of capital as logical time gives it a concrete meaning by putting into relations so many moments of logical movement, thus denying absolute timelessness of logical capital without nonetheless succumbing to diachronic time. I see this dynamic at work in Marxist conceptualization of contradiction of capital. Of course, contradiction is a logical modality. Marx writes, the historical broadening and deepening of the phenomenon of exchange develops the opposition between use value and value, that is the exchange value, which is latent in the nature of the commodity. The unfolding of this opposition raises it to the status of contradiction. But such contradiction is not resolved dialectically, neither will such contradiction blow up capital. Rather, Marx writes, quote, the further development of the commodity does not abolish these conditions, but rather provides the form within which they have room to move. So, here we have contradictions that are deferred in terms of logical movement. So I wonder whether this motion of contradiction can be understood precisely as an expression of logical time. In other words, the cycle money, though logically simultaneous, must entail a certain order of operations. And due to this temporalization, the contradictions must neither be resolved nor explode, but they have space to move. And you can recall the second volume of Capital, where Marx has this Baroque formula for us, money, commodity, labor, means of production, process of labor, commodity with a strict, more money, and so on. So one can think of these logical operations. And of course, capitalism is an automatic subject, but I think it is in its movement, which appears logically simultaneous, but in fact entails logical temporalization, these suspensive scansions of logical gaps, that violent modes of domination intervene on the account of the ruling class. So this, in the glimpses of diachrony, in the temporal instances governing logical order, the state violence, gender oppression, racism that is not imminent to logical capital takes place. But this is, of course, where something like class struggle also takes place. So a strike, for example, takes place precisely in the logical gap between certain operations. And this is what I'm trying to think. So this insight is especially evident in crisis, but it is, I think, a perpetual effect in the reproduction of capital. So if the logical simultaneity of credit collapses when the moment of settling accounts suddenly come, the state intervenes. And then there are chronic problems. So violence takes place here, and one can also think of the example of the kind of pressure you put on Greece. Capital should never stop circulating, but they cut off the liquidity, so in the logical gap, then push through a certain political program and let capital circulate again. So this is what I mean by certain violence or certain resistance that can take place in the logical gaps. In these operations. Okay, so in conclusion, I would like to then raise some questions as a challenge to Marxist thought. If indeed capitalism is accelerating and becoming more abstract, perhaps the task is to respond to these abstractions by making them concrete, but not in the way of telling particular stories. In other words, the materialist thought should appropriate the abstractions of advanced capitalism by making them concrete in negotiating logical time of capital and the reappearance of the diachronic in the violence done in the name of reproduction of capital. So I think to account for logical time makes it possible to account new forms of exploitation, for example, affective exploitation. But it also allows us, I think, and this is what is important for me, we can have talk about it in this discussion, to retain Marxist labor theory of value, because labor theory of value connect systematically the production of surplus and exploitation and domination. Although labor theory of value does not appear to account to many phenomena today, such as the fact that you are on your phone in leisure time producing more surplus value, I think by remodeling the logic, where the logical time is or how the logical time works, we can nonetheless retain these insights that Marx formulated. So I think if I'm on the right track, I think the challenge to Marxist thought is actually to produce a strong concept of potentiality that would be able to retain this connection between exploitation and surplus value production in the new phenomena of like capitalism. Thank you.
So next speaker, and then.
Thanks everybody for coming. I want to thank Peter for having me here. I know him because he's my office mate, so fortune put us together. So lucky for me, and I hope lucky for you guys today too. So what I got for you today is a paper about violence and some considerations for the left. So how did I get here? The primary aim of my dissertation is a joint reading of the work of Franz Fanon and Friedrich Nietzsche. Working through this project, I found that while politically antithetical, these thinkers thought coalesced around the notion that violence is fundamental to the establishment, persistence, and destruction of a system of values. Though important, this insight is only one aspect of the problematic traditionally known as the question of violence, as it needs much more to be analyzed. What's more, it is this insight about violence that allowed me to consider more robustly the question of violence itself. So for this workshop, I decided to offer some considerations, specifically three, that have come to mind in light of the research teaching that I've put into understanding violence and some of the issues around it. I hope these insights can be useful for those on the left. Okay. First consideration, is violence a problem? The question of violence, I ask the question rather than assert the problem exists. This is because when traditionally thinking about violence, the problem that this phenomenon is supposed to represent has a distinctly moral character. Is violence justified? If not, why? If so, when and under what circumstances is it justified? Much ink has been spilled over moralizing the question of violence, and I do not want to contribute to this discussion. This is primarily for two reasons. First, this allies the more fundamental question as to the nature of violence itself. While it seems important to first figure out what you're looking at in order to examine if it's good, evil, justified, or unjustified, this basic question is often taken for granted. But yet, this is an important question, but not for typological purposes of presenting what the phenomenon of violence is in an academic setting. However, I will leave the elaboration of the importance of developing an understanding of the nature of violence to a later consideration. Second, by casting the problem of violence as primarily an issue around ethics, this avoids the actuality of violence. What I mean to say is that thinking about violence in terms of the morality of it leaves one in the realm of abstraction, which avoids the concrete reality that continues to ravage the world. Moreover, the actuality of violence is taken for granted, which overlooks the work done with and through violence. It stands in the shadow of our discussions going unnoticed because this type of violence seems perfectly justified or justifiable, even to those who may espouse claims to violence never being moral. However, I believe there is one positive upshot to the traditional framing of the question of violence. If someone is seriously asking this question, this person is likely a liberal, which is to say that they're asking these types of questions seeking reasons to use violence to help reinforce and maintain the political order. Now, I have specifically in mind ethicists that try to justify, no, they do justify using torture, right? We've got journal articles all over the place with just loads of ink spilled over, like, well, maybe we can use torture, right? But there's a lesson to be learned from this. Act as if violence is already good and justified. There are no arguments to be had about it, no convincing the other of one's righteousness, no moral dilemmas, etc. As Gramsci notes, it is essential for parties to avoid even the justified experience of playing somebody else's game. By engaging in such arguments, one is playing a liberal game, and there's no need to engage in such shenanigans. There's the old joke that you know who the liberal is in the room. When an argument breaks out, passion runs, and that person leaves. Well, now you know who the revolutionary is when an insipid, moralizing argument about violence breaks out, and that person leaves the scene. But all jokes aside, this position still necessitates a clear conception of violence. Consideration 2, the nature of violence. All right, so I actually, to really think about this in in my chance to work through this stuff, I actually taught a course to some students on violence. So I'm interpolating some of my experience of teaching that course into this bit. So when I taught the course on violence and was working through the material with the students, I made three choices. The first choice was in light of the first consideration already laid out. I was not going to assume what violence was and move to moralizing the phenomenon. The decision to avoid the topic of ethics of violence led to the second choice, which was that of developing the course around a more fundamental question of the character of violence itself. Along these lines of outlining the nature of violence, there are some ways of approaching this kind of project. A common way has been to determine the metaphysical status of violence. That is, some theorists have taken to attempting to ascertain if violence is part of the natural order of things, or something that indicates some free choice on the part of some intention-led being. The path of naturalizing violence is interesting, but carries with it two problems. The first is that it can make the problem of violence entirely into an entirely amoral phenomenon. While this seems helpful, this approach is itself a value judgment about violence, and it is the added ambiguity of making it really difficult to distinguish violence from nonviolence. The second concern points to the previous consideration. Often people mistake natural with good or justified. By naturalizing violence, one is really just falling into the previous problem of moralizing violence. The alternative of placing violence in the context of freedom of intention is where violence is most commonly understood and is a major component of the lexical definition of violence, which I'll be discussing in a moment. Moving away from the metaphysics of violence, one can think about violence as ontological status instead. In other words, one is asking about violence in its order and relationship to other fundamental phenomena. Positions range from violence being fundamental, guiding phenomena, to that of violence being subordinate to other phenomena, to violence being epiphenomena. While the more plausible positions place violence as secondary phenomenal, determining the importance of violence in the order of being still leaves one with questions about what kind of phenomena it is. To put it this differently, one is left with determining violence's function, use, purpose, or work in the various ontological frameworks. With regard to understanding violence' place in the world, many thinkers have focused on if violence is a means in and in itself or both. While most fall on the side of conceptualizing violence as purely instrumental, this leaves a lot of content to be determined. All one has to do is ask, what does it look like to employ such means? Or how does the means appear in the world? This question brings one back to the actuality of violence, which intellectually is only a means, but the experience of it exceeds its meaning as such. In other words, there's much more to the nature of violence than it being purely means to ends. Then there's the more Platonic, analytically minded approach to seeking some clear definition that seeks to capture the phenomena in the most basic sense. More than the metaphysics, ontology, or teleology of violence, this approach attempts to get at violence as it is. A nice place to start is the basic lexical definition, which is physical force intended to harm. This definition is rather austere and limited, but with it there are two key components that are very clear. First is that of physical force. If violence is merely physical force, then what about other types of force that are not physical but certainly cause harm? For example, most would agree that propaganda or brainwashing are phenomena that cause harm but are not physical forces. Thankfully, the United Nations definition broadens violence to include power dynamics and threatening behavior while keeping the characteristic of intention. While this broadens violence to a phenomenon that seems beyond mere physical force, it is still nonetheless problematic because the issue of intention still remains. Second issue is that of intention, which I'll only briefly discuss because I have more to say about this in a later consideration. To begin, we often describe phenomena like volcanic eruptions, hurricanes, earthquakes, and tsunamis as violent. But very few secular, sober-minded people are going to agree that behind these events is an intention to harm. But yet notice how if one removes intention from the definition, one easily slips back into naturalism. And so I have a note here that says is that it truly probably ties into related specifically to the conference. We can think about what do we mean when we say, oh, the violence of capitalism, right? So that's why I think this would sort of fall into this kind of question, right? In terms of describing something like that. Also, I saw Kisty's paper and pointed out sort of how a lot of the discourse around capitalism, right, is being naturalized, right? And so I think it's a really important consideration to think about, right? Furthermore, and as previously alluded to, there's a problem with such a broad definition of violence that most anything can be violent. And because of this, it becomes exceedingly difficult to distinguish violence from other phenomena. As with the case with art, if everything is violence, then nothing is violence. Now, if one were to frame intention in purely anthropocentric terms, which is still very problematic because it seems that other forms of life have intentions to use force and harm, even this is a problem. The example that nicely shows this is a drunk driver killing another person in a car crash. As I explained to the students, it seems unlikely that the driver at some point in time in the past decided to imbibe too much alcohol and then sought to find somebody to harm with their car. I grant that the person may have other violent intentions, but most drunk drivers will claim that hiding in a car crash was not their intended desire. But we certainly say that, oh yes, it's a violent car crash, right? Why that person do that violence? And, finally, there is the bad faith argument that one cannot really know one's intentions, what one's intentions is or is not. What all this means is that it seems like the whole issue of intentions is rather murky. So what do all these different ways of approaching the nature of violence and the logic chopping that this entailed intended to highlight about the phenomena, but what are some of the offshots for thinkers on the left? It seems that the question still remains that any approach seems to limit what many intuitively consider to be violence. Regardless of the approach, moreover, one seems to be on the cycle of producing pointless subjective descriptions of violence. Or worse, it seems that the work has brought us to the point of being unable to distinguish violence from other phenomena. Maybe attempting to conceptually illuminate the phenomenon of violence just leads to one more pointless aporia. And thinkers were right for avoiding the fundamental question and moving to a more practical moral concerns about what most would recognize as just violence being. So everybody knows what violence is. You just see, you know it, right? Let's just move on if it's good or bad or not. However, there's a solution to this problem that is important to the left. Because of the difficulty in defining and describing violence, we on the left can use this ambiguity to clearly articulate what revolutionary violence is. So instead of philosophical conceptual meandering, I'm suggesting that the left use the space to employ the austere, limited lexical definition of violence to help stipulate and clarify a position about what revolutionary violence entails. However, the issue then becomes about what the left specifies as intentionality, and it is around this issue that the left can develop a concept of revolutionary violence. It is with intentionality that I will focus my final consideration, but there is one last offshot to reflect upon before moving on. That is, for more academic purposes, but no less important for left thinkers, it is from this way of developing an intelligible conception of violence that one can begin to develop more coherent metaphysics or ontology. Consideration 3, revolutionary violence and intentionality. Final consideration is what I've been holding off on for a moment, the issue of intentionality. With defining violence, there's not a problem with stating its effects quite clearly and the type of phenomena that represents sufficient causes. That is, there's little argument about the harm by force component of the definition. Harm, damage, destruction, all within phenomena that are cast as violent. Regardless of how the effect of harm is brought about, be they by physical or non-physical forces, these are fundamental components of the concept. Rather, the real problem of violence is with the intentionality component of the definition. I previously noted that the whole issue of intentionality seems quite murky. This is because intentionality is presumed to be on the individual psychological level. On this level, intentionality is not suited for revolutionary violence. It sits squarely within the liberal order of rank as it places primary focus and makes most important the individual and their murky desires and intentions. This has the consequence of framing the problem of violence as being merely a matter of idiosyncratic, individualistic psychology. What's more, this understanding of violence sits at the level of particular, while providing little hope for transcending to the level of universal or historical. Coalescing a revolutionary movement around this notion of violence does not provide a clear direction in which violence is intended. What's more, there remains the problem of spontaneous violence and attempting to direct that toward a larger revolutionary program. Ultimately, this issue around understanding violence, particularly in terms of revolutionary violence, requires a choice about how to define intention. Intention in this case rests not with understanding it on the individual psychological level, but rather the meaning of intention here is placed on the programmatic level. That is, the definition of violence must be rooted in a broader revolutionary program, which from capitalism and its concomitant problems of race, class, gender, nationalism, etc. The intention to harm is clear, and it is directed to the structures and artifacts that constitute the capitalist world that we all have. By defining intention with the level of revolutionary program, the problem of intention is no longer known. What's more, it provides useful heuristic for determining if violence is revolutionary or not. One only has to ask if there is a programmatic intention to such violence. However, I do not want to overstate the importance of this. Having a clear but basic understanding of violence is more a footnote in our program than a concrete tenet. But with this, it can articulate a program that does not rely on liberal concepts to implicitly frame how to go about understanding violence, the problems that arise, and the proper resolutions. Concluding remarks. What I've tried to do is lay out how violence has been traditionally problematized in order to develop a coherent understanding of revolutionary violence for the left. The first consideration I use to leave at abeyance moralizing the problem of violence. This is a very common, almost reflexive response and approach to the phenomena that the left must refrain from engaging. Instead, the problem of violence must address the second consideration about the fundamental nature of violence. While this can be one of the morass of metaphysics and ontology, this can be avoided with a simple solution of using the lexical definition of violence to provide a definition of revolutionary violence. However, this comes with one critically important caveat, which is the third consideration, that intention must be stipulated to have meaning only at the programmatic level. By reframing the problem of violence in terms of stipulating the intention of violence as at the level of the movement's program, the left benefits from the articulation is clear, easy to convey, and lacks the ambiguity that could lead to returning to the question of violence to the traditional problematics and ensuing issues. That intention is not with some individual or with some group of individuals, but with the revolutionary movement's program is critical. Now, all of this is really to begin to articulate a position that avoids liberalism and its bad faith relationship to violence and its uses. That is, in many ways, what I'm articulating is what liberalism takes for granted. With their police and armies, liberals have programmatic violence entrenched in the capitalist world order. However, by eliminating this, the left can properly direct its energies to more pressing problems of developing a coherent program that all people can coalesce and develop a consciousness that transcends that of the capitalist world. Thank you.
And next speaker, David Murphy.
I'm David Murphy. I studied politics about a decade ago with Peter at the University of Salford. In the intervening time, I worked for BBC News in London as a newsreader and announcer at a radio station in Melbourne. But I've continued to read alternative economic theory and remain endlessly fascinated by the structural forces acting in broadly comparable ways on the housing market and on the working poor who attempt to navigate this labyrinthine construct in each of the jurisdictions in which I live. So we're here to talk about the triumph of liberalism and the challenge to Marxist theory. I could talk about the promise of liberalism in 18th century Ireland and failed revolutionary effort by the United Irishmen led by Wolfe Tone. I could talk about the effect of the Union with Britain on the industrialisation of Ireland and Marx's views on the destruction of the Irish industry and poor governance, which he said would lead to either ruin or revolution. I could talk about the role of laissez-faire economic theory in the famine, with the example of the Belgian response as a comparison, where a population comparably dependent on the potato crop were governed by an elite who pursued what we would consider today to be protectionist measures, and only 60,000 died. Only 60,000. The rise of the Land League and the hatred of the rentier, failed attempts by Liberal Prime Minister William Gladstone to resolve the Irish question. I could talk about those too. The 1913 lockout of Dublin workers and Jim Larkin, which later became the subject of Ireland's only epic novel, Strumpet City, which I would totally recommend. I could also talk about the socialist James Connolly, shot in a wheelchair in Kilmainham jail for his role in the 1916 Easter Rising, failure of Republican forces to win the Civil War or to set the agenda for the priorities of the new state. I could talk about the construction of the family as the basic unit of social life in the aftermath of the Civil War, with most other collective institutions undermined or destroyed. The substitution of the church for the former colonial oppressor, and fracturing nationalism along class lines. But I'm not going to talk about any of that. I'm going to try and stay in the present and discuss the challenges we face today while acknowledging very loud echoes from the past. As those of you who have already let me know, I've been writing a manuscript on the Irish housing crisis for the last year, the working title of which is Ballymun by Bicycle. Ballymun is where I grew up and has since been demolished, having been built in 1966 and months later declared Ireland's worst planning disaster. There were curious and intelligent people in Ballymun, as in every working class community. However, vanishingly few of our number had the opportunity to go to university, examine the forces that govern our lives, the analytical tools of Marx, Hegel, or even Friedrich von Hayek. Books about Ballymun, such as The Mun by Lynn Connolly, portray the town as having an exceptional community spirit in the face of adversity. Lynn, A Story of Prostitution, written with feminist June Levine, focused on the story of a Ballymun sex worker, a famous murder case. In a country which was ignorant of the perils of sex work, the perpetrator was Lynn's partner, John Cullen. The story shocked 1980s Ireland and provoked demonstrations. Lynn testified in the case and remains in hiding in Britain to this day. Dying to Survive by Rachel Keogh features a graphic photo on its front cover of a pretty blonde girl with gangrenous skin in the folds of her arms where injection sites had become infected. She had been self-administering heroin, to which she was addicted. She's since fully recovered. These stories, while important, form a sort of dramaturgy which the rest of the society has consumed, while never reflecting on the material conditions that led to the adversity and the social alienation within the community and without, and indeed in the minds of the people who lived there, that led them to feel under siege or to be so vulnerable. And I quote from Seneca Cobb, "The reason the prejudice image exists at all is that it serves a purpose, as does this whole scheme of individuals recognized and respected by virtue of ability. This purpose is to continue the iniquities of the world of the 19th century industrial capitalism on new terrain." My goal in writing this book is mainly to provide the Irish reader with some analytical tools and historical corollaries to describe the situation of housing in Ireland in 2019. This is a journalistic exercise primarily with a little autobiography and a review of the literature available that describes the problems we face. But if the Irish experience tells us anything, it's that we've been here before, and without deep and lasting reform to labour exploitation, financialisation, and rent-seeking behaviour, we will be again. Many people have undertaken extraordinary original research to provide some of the insights I rely on, and I owe them a great deal, not just in terms of manuscripts, but personally as well. For it was only in describing to myself the issues I came to know so intimately, as a child growing up in Ballymun, the importance and centrality of land and place to the society, and how it informs the social order of the country as well. The ephemeral nature of social relations for me is best represented by the challenges and opportunities provided by the real estate market and the crisis in housing. How we understand the issue of housing is an insight into how, under late liberalism or neoliberalism, individuals with no access to capital are in a contest for space, the state also acting as the speculator, institutional investors and others who are seeking a return on their capital investment as real estate continues to outstrip the rewards from many other forms of economic activity. The housing crisis is but one manifestation of several concurrent crises arising from the treatment internationally of housing as an asset class, the involvement of Ireland as a political entity within the single currency, the shadow banking system, and the structures of the Anglo-American economic project, normally called neoliberalism, which came to replace the way we describe old colonial systems of power and exploitation. The crisis is a manifestation of a deep malaise afflicting the societies of the Western world and is an advanced stage in Ireland for a number of reasons, namely, but not limited to, highly speculative development preceding the crisis, early bailout on bad terms, the collapse of the construction sector, and the failure to fund infrastructural development, of which housing provision forms an essential part. Striking annual increases in the value of the housing stock, only 10% of which in Ireland can be considered non-market or uncommodified, also sees the state selling land at the prevailing market rate and spending now €750 million a year on homeless assistance payments to the private market, creating upward inflationary pressure on rents. Alex Marsh from the University of Bristol, speaking about the Housing Welfare Bill in the UK, makes the point we have gone from subsidising properties to subsidising people. Housing has become financialised and increasingly embedded in the global financial system. Some of the problems in the housing market are, if you like, coincidentally about housing. Even for market fundamentalists in Ireland, we wish to see a functional market which most can access. It's not a pretty picture. At the start of this year, one of the country's leading housing economists said builders cannot deliver houses at the right price for most buyers. Goodbye chief economist Dermot O'Leary suggested housing shortages will continue for most income earners, even if supply were to double from its present rate. As foreign capital competes for sites with local buyers, spiraling building costs and booming land prices have pushed the average price across the country to €237,000. Using revenue office statistics, he calculated roughly half of wage earners could only afford a mortgage of €175,000 under current lending rules. They have a 2.5 annual limit on income, I think. In Dublin, more than half of new homes were sold for more than that figure, with 1 in 5 sold at over $500,000, with asking prices in the city going up by €1,000 a month on average in the last year. Dr. Rory Hearn from the University of Maynooth makes the point that this is not a miscalculation or an unpleasant side effect of government policy. It's very important to them that this should happen. The housing crisis has also been, this is a quote from Rory Hearn. The housing crisis has also been caused by wider government policy from 2010 to encourage the entry of global investors and vulture funds via various tax incentives, lobbying, and fire sale of assets into Ireland in order to offload toxic loans from NAMA. NAMA is the National Asset Management Agency, which is a bank. Probably not here. And the banks. The rising house prices and rents post-2013 were also viewed positively and were promoted as an enticement to investors, while rising prices and rents were also viewed positively for rehabilitating the balance sheet of the banks, a core aim of all policy post-2008. The impact on the housing system was not considered an issue. I argue in the manuscript that the Irish state did not answer the questions raised by groups like the 19th Century Land League, to which they arguably owe their existence. The question of dispossession, evident not just from the number who are homeless in institutional settings, such as the reopened Magdalen Laundry on Grace Park Road, which is now in private management, or in insecure accommodation, but from regular episodes of mass immigration since the state's formation. Since the inception of the state in 1922, land reform, which from the formation of the state was piecemeal and often used to shore up political support within local communities, was open to abuse. It is renting the land back to the people which provided the most potential income from the point of view of large elites, whoever they may be. Regardless of what happens with European tax harmonization or regularization of the shadow banking system, it will be reasonable to assume that this situation will not change without a reevaluation of the nature of private property rights in Ireland. The establishment in Ireland is, however, in agreement with the neoliberal consensus, with the official opposition providing confidence and supply to a minority government for several years now, and they will divorce, we are told, but for baby Brexit. It could also be no coincidence that the possibilities offered by Ireland's legal framework, its relationship to Britain and cultural inheritance intersect with the rent-seeking priorities of neoliberalism itself. The form of economic management prevalent in Ireland is preference to international capital in all things. The US, our main trading partner, is the progenitor of this iteration of Anglo-American capitalism since the Big Bang in 1986 and the Washington Consensus in 1992. Our status as the largest tax haven within the sterling zone, and by some measures the world, tells you much about who the government worry about as a constituency, and yet these goals are mostly unstated. Minister for Housing Damien English, as recently as May this year, said our solutions are working, despite the highest recorded homelessness figures in the state's history, numbering over 10,000, a figure which includes 3,800 children. On Taoiseach, our Prime Minister, Leo Varadkar, said within the last few days that there will always be a certain number of people in emergency accommodation, as he attempts to normalize this extraordinary state of affairs. In a society where many are quite comfortable and willing to believe news that is consistent with their experience of life, this achieves a status of the permanent lie. Writing in the origins of totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt describes this phenomenon as the result of a consistent and total substitution of lies for factual truth. It is not that the lie will now be accepted as truth and the truth be defamed as a lie, but the sense by which We take our bearings in the real world, and the category of truth versus falsehood is among the mental means to this end is being destroyed. So what we are left with is a working class in Ireland to experience a gap between cultural goals and institutional means. As home ownership is still seen as the ideal and an important class marker. The failure to achieve this in these circumstances is therefore easily framed as a personal failure. As Stephen Luke's put it, the dominant ideology works its magic by persuading subordinate groups to believe actively in the values that explain and justify their own subordination. Or to return to Senator Cobb, who described how this dynamic is self-reinforcing, search for respect is thwarted, the individual feels personally responsible for the failure, and the whole attempt accustoms him to think that to have individual respect you must have social inequality. As in any place, class in Ireland is a deeply psychological affair and is not always made obvious by material deprivation, though they frequently intersect. A class society, as Sartre has remarked, is a society of scarce resources unfairly distributed because some have arbitrary power. The situation here is one where the psychological dimensions of class serve a purpose, legitimating deprivation, unfair allocation of resources, and paltry rewards. Close quote. Since the events of 2008, a paltry reward is all that has been on offer for many in Ireland if you did not leave as 300,000 others did. Yet the cultural parameters of success are still broadly the same. Durkheim called this state economic enemy, an internalized shame, which is compounded by neoliberal economic management and its focus on individual attainment, which is ultimately a project about the restoration of upper class power. They derive their power through the mechanisms of the colonial state, with a laissez-faire approach to economic management, rebranded as neoliberalism in the information age, adapted to suit the ends of tech utopians, rent-seeking financiers, and the privatisation of public goods. The workforce is bifurcated into a core and a periphery with a scant safety net below after a decade of deflation and austerity following the global financial crisis. Workers in finance, pharmaceuticals, and the chartered professions are well compensated, while the rest compete for resources, in many ways more like the United States and Europe, particularly with the predominance and spiralling cost of private health insurance. The Irish middle class, though greatly expanded from their humble beginnings in the Dublin civil service, and the professions arguably owe much of their cultural outlook to this generational memory. You would say that, so forgive me. Frank O'Connor, writing in 1942, said an author such as Chekhov would write as easily of a princess as of a peasant girl or a merchant's daughter within Ireland. The moment a writer raises his eyes from the slums and cabins, he finds nothing but vicious and ignorant middle class, and for aristocracy the remnants of an English garrison, alien in religion and education. From such material, he finds it almost impossible to create a picture of life. Realistic literature is clearly impossible. Just being very self-indulgent there, I'm sorry. Even for the middle class, though, there is too much of a tendency, Althusser says, to regard different classes of people as living in different worlds. One speaks of alienation of labour, for instance, thinking workers bored by the tedium of the machine, but seldom of a manager bored by pushing papers. Of course, these experiences feel entirely different to the persons involved, but they have the same root cause. To have class differences, you must first have a generator, common force or structure that divides people up. That is a second quote. I believe that first and foremost, the force is where you live and how much agency you have in the decision as to where you would be. To give you a flavour of where I first consciously found myself, I'll read the first of 3 extracts from the manuscript. In the towns neighbouring Ballymun, Santry, Glasnevin and Finglas, I often went on wild goose chases to find some person or place I wasn't sure existed. I hadn't found a gang for protection, so I learned to line up my bicycle at an angle and bolt out of the lift through the squat doorless lobby into the daylight beyond. On my journeys around north inner suburban Dublin, through the sprawling maze of flats, tower blocks, and tiny terraced council houses, I raced along swollen arterial roads and smaller empty streets. The bicycle was a perfect vehicle as I took these solitary journeys. Others have written on the subject of Ballymun with an enduring sense that it is a place with a remarkable sense of community. I tend to see it in terms of shared experience and institution. At its best, it was like a dreary school where no classes took place, or a prison with degrees. Ballymun was a sink estate, starved of funding to make improvements to civic communities. It had an image problem in the rest of the country, and if you were from there, so did you. The character and physical environment of Ballymun was inseparable from its alienation from the rest of the city. As a child, I crossed an invisible border that demarcated an enclave of poverty amidst the light industry and airport to the north, and and the inner suburbs of North Dublin to the south. Future-proofed motorways linked with enormous sodium vapour lamps cut through the town like wounds on a skeletal body whose only nourishment came in mean, taxpayer-subsidised rations. On leaving, the air seemed less stale and colours brighter, incongruent with the sombre grey towers which stood behind the brightly lit embankments. This view from the road was most people's experience of the Ballymont at that time, travelling uninterrupted before pausing at an elaborate roundabout visible from my bedroom window on the fourth story of an adjacent tower block. My room faced onto a large balcony with a concrete balustrade about waist high, with no glass or awning. At night I often watched with my arms folded on the ledge as those drivers briefly surveyed the scene before accelerating crisply toward the airport nearby. The second reading is a little longer, and in this I try to describe Tina's long grip on Ireland, though I had not heard the term late liberalism before I encountered Peter again a few days ago. But to my mind this legitimises its use, and I'll be considering her. I'd like to open with a party scene. At a party in London, in the spring of 1882, San Francisco journalist Henry George was introduced to the English philosopher Herbert Spencer. Though he was angling to meet Alfred Tennyson, the playwright Robert Browning, the prospect of meeting Spencer gave him real pleasure. George's book, Progress and Poverty, a treatise on inequality, the cyclic nature of industrialised economies, and the use of land value tax as a remedy, was published to acclaim 3 years before, and made use of Spencer's arguments against the private ownership of land, which he had made 3 decades earlier. Spencer was by then the most famous intellectual of his day, credited with coining the phrase survival of the fittest and there is no alternative in defence of free markets, a favourite refrain from Margaret Thatcher. You must have already known the answer when he asked the younger George, who had written a defence of the Irish Land League a year before for his opinion of the rent strike taking place in Ireland at the time. George believed Spencer shared his views and expressed his support for the protesters who by then had been imprisoned. At which point Spencer burst into vehement dissent. They have only got what they deserve, said Spencer. They are inciting the people to refuse to pay to their landlords what is rightfully theirs, rent. This speech and the manner of its delivery so differed from what was expected of a man who in social statics wrote, "Equity does not permit property in land." That Mr. George was at first astonished and then disgusted at his flat denial of principle. It is evident we cannot agree on this matter, was all that he could say. He abruptly left Mr. Spencer. That bad-tempered encounter in the rarefied atmosphere of a London salon became more than a quibble over solutions, namely Spencer's proposed land nationalisation or George's single tax. In competing polemics over the years, the elder man accused George of believing the individual has no rights. In response, George said Spencer was guilty of intellectual prostitution and that he compromised for anxiety for honours. Progress and poverty inspired land reform movements across the English-speaking world, and George's pamphlet, The Irish Land Question, was explicitly intended as an appeal to the land leagues. While Henry George did not support the seizure of private land in Ireland, he saw the tendency to concentration of ownership and the primacy of the rights of landlords as a denial of a right to the elements necessary to the maintaining of life. Open quote, "Since all the Irish people have the same equal right to live, if they are all in Ireland by the same permission of nature, so that all the rest of them could not justly say to any one of them, you have not the same right to live as we have. Therefore we will pitch you out of Ireland into the sea." Close quote. As individuals, we bring assumptions to bear on the issue of housing that are grounded in an emotive view of history. As a people, our tortured relationship with the land has left us feeling that once we have a freehold, our rights should be as unrestricted as our former oppressors. Open quote. Perhaps it's a lingering aftermath of 800 years of British oppression and colonialism, said Dr. Vittorio Perfacci, a philosophy professor at University College Cork, but Ireland has a profoundly unhealthy understanding of private property, thinking of it as our private fiefdom. Any interference by third parties, including the state, is perceived as the essence of social injustice. He said this gives too much power to wealthy individuals and managing institutions. The Irish state, in aping its colonial predecessor, has failed us. The fact of the state's inability to house its citizens, and though it long ago industrialised, the persistence of mass immigration suggests deep structural problems. Dublin has had a strong tradition of devastating housing outcomes for at least the last 3 centuries. The same researchers who discovered this also found, having trawled through 20,000 records, that large increases in property values are a recent phenomenon. A finding consistent with similar studies in other states. The current crisis in housing owes as much to this recent extraordinary period of land speculation by the state, as well as investors, as it does to the collapse in house building and an ideological retreat from the concept of public housing. Rampant income inequality, which afflicts the Irish more than almost any other people in the European Union, disguises the gravity of the crisis for those who can afford to participate in the private market. The Irish state, since its conception, never lost sight of the value of the land under its control. Through the Land Commission, the ruling party bought land and subdivided it into parcels, often for local political advantage. It was the inheritor of some 250,000 ground rents. The clientelism inheritance efforts was the prologue to the rigged system of today. Ireland's greatest export has not been beef or even pharmaceuticals, it has been rent. Within Ireland, it has both been necessary and possible to co-opt the leadership in this endeavour, not unlike other colonised societies. History doesn't repeat itself, but it often rhymes, goes an apocryphal quote attributed to the American writer Mark Twain. Forceful eviction at a farm near Scrogestown last year rocked the country, with one commentator describing the events as the most shameful incident since Black Jackadair's scourge of evicting tenants from his acquired lands on Donegal's Derry Bay estate in April 1861. The property was repossessed over unpaid debts to KBC Bank. The bank had instructed a security firm based in Northern Ireland to forcibly remove two elderly brothers and their sister. At least one family member suffered injuries as members of the police force looked on. A few days later, in excess of 70 people stormed the farm in the early hours of the morning. 8 were injured and 4 vehicles were set alight. One of the security personnel was later revealed to be 49-year-old debt collector Ian Gordon, a former British soldier. I think I'll actually just move on from Scrogestown. The events in Scrogestown were an echo from our history and a warning. The dynamic of coercion and reaction framed by violence is a familiar story which, in its reenactment, inflames passions but solves nothing. Martin Luther King, writing in 1963 about his nonviolent campaign for racial equality in Birmingham, Alabama, spoke of nonviolence as a powerful and just weapon, a weapon unique in history which cuts without wounding and ennobles the person who wields it. The success of the campaign King describes in Why We Can't Wait was made possible by embracing non-violent cooperation, acknowledging that often opposition comes not only from the conservatives who cling to tradition, but also from the extremist militants who favour neither the old nor the new. The past is not a different country, and we are not bound to it. It is the same country, and we can do things differently. But it is not enough to repudiate the vigilantism of Scrogestown and our history of violent reaction without addressing the structural violence of the Irish state and its institutions. The scale of the crisis we face is not limited to the homeless, but the vast number of risks of homelessness. The crisis, which has left 10,000 of our citizens without a home, requires us to stage a showdown of a rentier who in this latest iteration has found new ways to extract resources using the protection of the state to make a few wealthy by exploiting and displacing the rest. Today's crisis is a crisis of social relations which has many faces. It is in our relationship with Europe, our role in international finance, both of which facilitate the tide of capital flowing out of the country since 2008. The bailout which followed revealed the architecture of the crisis, but its foundations were built a long time ago. The ideas that dominate our thinking about land and rights are so old, the names of their authors are recited from memory. In piecing together that fragmented history, we can see that the mistakes of the past are not artifacts of a different era, but a centuries-old problem repackaged for our times. So, what do we do? Alex Marsh from Bristol describes what might be possible within the current set of arrangements. Ensuring people are adequately housed prior to rather than overconsumption by others, increasing housing supply, land value tax on vacant land, taxation of second homes, consistent housing tax treatment for primary residences, smoothing volatility, enhance housing supply, looking carefully at macro-prudential regulation, extending council tax bans to higher price properties, the list goes on. Well, I don't think it's enough. The problem with rentier and its toxic effect on self-perception and class in Ireland is, to my mind, so deep and so urgent that nothing less than a reworking of how we conceptualise land and its use, rather than its exchange value, is what is required. So, to coin a phrase, what is to be done? Wholesale decommodification of all land controlled by the state, along with downward pressure on property values so that their inflation remains at zero, could be our starting point. We could achieve this through the implementation of rent controls and the socialization of the banking system. I'm really dreaming now. Paul Mason, writing in Post-Capitalism, suggests a socially just form of financial repression aimed at controlling write-down of the massive debt overhang, and by setting an explicit target for sustainable growth and an inflation target on the high side of the recent average. Restructure the banking system into a mixture of utilities earning capped profit rates, non-profit local and regional banks, credit unions, peer-to-peer lenders, and a comprehensive state-owned provider of financial services as a lender of last resort. Mason goes on to suggest in post-capitalism the highly automated economy of the future is one in which people work in cooperative, self-managed, non-hierarchical teams. And in this network future, we could of course include greater emphasis on housing cooperatives for those who wish to live in particular communities, or decommodified social housing stock built for or bought from the deflated existing stock for those who have to leave their circumstances for all the reasons you can imagine people need to. If they're happy with where they are and wish to build a community with others, the mode of ownership could be transferable. These are all just ideas, but we don't discuss them. The Irish workforce should assume that they will again be faced with a large-scale financial crisis, property price crash, or both. The architecture of the financial system in which Ireland is deeply integrated has not changed in the intervening years since 2008, and another crash is inevitable. This will either provide another opportunity for those in control to fulfill their structural imperatives and carry out large-scale restructuring of public assets in Ireland, unless the workforce plans for this event, requiring the government to put in place arrangements for a constitutional convention on pain of a general strike. Ireland is a small country and will get nowhere without the support of other small countries in the European Union, many of which are afflicted by similar crises. The activities of housing advocacy groups such as Inner City Helping Homeless, while vital in saving lives and ameliorating suffering in the short term, do not challenge the orthodoxy of private property rights and land speculation, calling instead for greater provision of public housing. If these charities were to ambitiously augment their activities to include emancipation of the poor, rendering them no longer as supplicants, they would better serve themselves and their constituents. As that famous socialist Oscar Wilde said, the best amongst the poor are never grateful. They are ungrateful, discontented, disobedient, and rebellious, and they are quite right to be so. Charity they feel to be a ridiculously inadequate mode of partial restitution or a sentimental dole, usually accompanied by some impertinent attempt on the part of the sentimentalist to tyrannize over their private lives. Why should they be grateful for the crumbs that fall from the rich man's table? In the same essay, he goes on to suggest the proper aim should be to reconstruct society on such a basis that poverty is impossible. Growing up as a child in public housing, which was so aesthetically different from everything around it, administered by non-residents of the town, designed by people who had never lived there, it is evident that we need to bear in mind, this is Biareishyk, Hayek's arguments about the socially constituted, tacit and limited nature of individual human knowledge. Subjectivity of knowledge means that the welfare state officials confront an insuperable knowledge problem. How are they to know whether the implementation of a particular policy will enhance the capabilities of any unique individual? This is not a problem derived simply from plural conceptions of good living. It is a problem of how to achieve, in particular cases, an intersubjective standard of good living among diverse and dispersed individuals, each of whom possesses unique knowledge of the circumstances of time and place that affects his or her ability to live well. This is a factual knowledge problem, not an ethical knowledge problem. I will end with one more extract, a short one, from the manuscript, which I hope will illustrate a view from outside Ireland where, because of this hallowed set of arrangements, so many of us ended up, and I start with a description of my hometown. It is at once a colonial city and a living metaphor. It is imposing and exclusive, but homely and faded. It is where suburban people also share a rich social life. The adaptable Gael, the quality often occurs, is able to imagine simultaneously a pantheon of characters in their world, all of whom are possible. This interior richness springs from the dead winter landscape, keeps us warm through the darkest nights and spaces which lie between the inland towns and coastal cities. We come together frequently in the community hall, the church and the pub to talk, debate and affirm. The capital bears the scars of our war on each other. Apart from the Civil War or the bullet holes of the 1916 Rising, now mediated through the market, it is a space contested more fiercely than many of its peers. In 2017, there were only 12 streets in the world more expensive to rent than Grafton Street. The city and its residents have an outsized and at times inflated sense of significance for and after all, Dublin is the capital of a country with a diaspora of some 70 million people. On some level, this is understood. Dublin has soft cultural power as well, for our symbolic value, what we represent, our stand against colonialism, our writers, our membership of the European Union, our de jure neutrality, and yet it is a site of avarice where it might have been a beacon of hope for the diaspora who might one day see Ireland as a place where at last they could stand.
We can gather some questions, I guess. So, who wants to start?
That was a very inspiring panel for me. And I mean, the emphasis on the word panel, meaning the combination of the three papers, hearing these three papers together, made me think a lot, and I'm going now to try to say what I've been thinking, and somewhere there will be some question, I'm not yet sure. Or many questions, I don't know. So, okay, I will start by focusing on José's paper. So, you spoke of intentionality that is not individual, but it is instead programmatic. Am I right, José? Right. So, to what extent is this again a defense of history as a subject, so to speak of intentionality? In his intentionality, you said yourself, is an anthropocentric concept, right? So do you encourage us to return to the concept of history as a subject, or is your argument something different? But now linking this to what David said, and you were considering, if I understand correctly, of a history as a subject, but a revolutionary subject. The revolutionary intentionality would be a programmatic intentionality. Okay? So if a subject appears in your paper, if history is constructed in your paper as a revolutionary subject, in David's paper, I think history is again conceived as a subject, but this is the oppressive subject. The subject that wants to sustain social inequalities. You said at a certain point that all this is done with a purpose. That's another word for intentionality. And the purpose is to sustain social inequality. So what I find very interesting is these two different historical subjects, the revolutionary and the oppressive. And then, turning now to Siarhei's argument, to what extent is the conception of history as a subject, whether revolutionary or oppressive, a conception of history that is diachronic, or can one think of intentionality, if one wants to think of intentionality, also in terms of logical time? And the last point, which again addresses all of you, very interesting was again, David, you mentioned that what all this oppressive ideology does on top of everything else is to install in individuals a sense of guilt, a sense of individual failure. So, which again presupposes that this oppressive historical subject projects onto individuals what in truth should be the intentionality of the historical subject, so that the individuals imagine that it was their own intention that failed, and therefore they feel individual failure, right? So, I don't know.
That's the truth.
That's what?
That's the truth.
That's it, okay, but I mean, that's not your point. But, yeah. No, I understand, that's why you said that this is the truth, yeah. Okay, so yeah, I think all these connections, no, very interesting. Anybody want to comment?
Would you like to respond or?
In terms of thinking about intentionality and subjectivity, I really didn't think about that in terms of history, right? But just offhand, if you move back people coalescing around a program, and that's history.
Because it can speak more clearly.
Yeah. so I haven't thought very much about the idea of subjectivity in relation to violence in history. Right, so I think it's a very, very good question, something really important to consider. But just offhand, in terms of history being a subject, right, if I mean by that, right, or if you mean by something like people coalescing around the program, right, sure, I guess history is the subject at that point in time, right? But here's the thing, I guess what makes me want to just sort of really think this through is that when I think of that, I think of Hegel and all the baggage of teleology that it presupposes. So on that end, I want to think about the problem just a little more, even though I do think it's a very, very important, good question. So.
I think the sort of, because there's a history in Ireland of the blue shirts and these are the sort of sensible middle class and then the poor, and in a way we couldn't exist without each other, like was being discussed earlier. I think it is not familiar with this vocabulary.
I think my conception of logical time excludes understanding of history as a subject. Because if there is intentionality, well, there isn't, but if there is, it's only one, I can name it right away, to reproduce this form, to reproduce the form of office.
Yeah, that's the intention, right? There's no harm in
It's very hard to call this intentionality at all.
Yeah, definitely,
right?
definitely.
So, in that sense, what David was describing perhaps it's nicely in my conception of logical time, because there's so much violence done, and it's repetitively, you show the repetitive nature of it. And to quote Marx again, that the events that take place between buying and selling does not change the form. So I think one shouldn't wonder about this violence. Rather, if one understands this kind of logical time in the reproduction of capital that I described, it makes sense by any means possible that this reproduction will take place. And so, in that sense, what takes place is as violence, as contingent violence, was then it could have been avoided. It takes place in these gaps between logical operations of reproduction, I would say. But I think to your question, I think it excludes precisely the understanding of history as a subject, but because history is a process.
That's what I understood too. But then we can say that it could have been avoided. Like in your talk, you used the expression crisis, violence, phenomena, racism, the other, which are not necessarily implied by the logical character, but are allowed. So I would like you to comment on this distinction, and also what on the one hand you say it's contingent, it could have not happened, but I think your argument also implies, and yet they're necessary.
Yes.
Yeah, so can you comment on that? Can you respond to that?
Of course. I mean, it's necessary because the contradictions need to move. We know there is symmetry between buying and selling, for example. There are certain contradictions in capital that needs to be negotiated, not resolved, but negotiated by violence. And therefore, this violence can take contingent forms. But in that it takes place, it is necessary.
And maybe it says something about how little the dynamics have actually changed in Ireland, that reflexively this is the response. Because you're talking about a whole community going into that farm, and they knew that London was British soldier and they were furious about this. So, the symbolism of that was very, very simple. And it was a real echo from what went before.
Yes, this is a follow-up to the last question for Sergei, but the others. I thought at some point at the end of your paper you said that violence, that racism is not imminent to capitalism. Immanent, it's not internal or constitutive or formative. No, to Sergei.
Oh, sorry.
Yes. And then, so that I was a little bit curious. What do you mean by that? Because I take racism to be constitutive of capitalism, one of its constituent elements. Because then in David's approach is that it seems in the housing crisis that it is indeed constitutive, at least in this specific case. So if just you can a bit formulate more what you meant by saying that racism is not immanent, is not internal to capitalism.
Or other forms of violence.
Yeah, I guess I should specify it's not in a strong sense. If in a strong sense it's necessary insofar as we have something like those who own the means of production and those who don't own the means of production, and historically this division is highly racialized. In that sense, it's necessary. So if we understand racism as relation between humans and subhumans, for example, then this is of course necessary in surplus production. But the forms that racism takes shape is contingent. That's what I meant. But of course, I mean, insofar as
because this question raises also the issue of colonialism.
Yes.
In its modern instantiation, that also relates to the question of Ireland, what was discussed, because I thought it was two different, relatively different approaches. But yes, if it's only the particular forms of racism, but not racism, yes. I think it clarifies a bit the question.
Yeah, I agree with Karina that the papers seem to fit extremely well together by good fortune, more than I think anything else. Yes, it was not. But I was reminded on the one hand of Weber on this question of violence, and because among other things, Weber understood market relations as relations of coercion and violence, which I think David's paper shows very well, because they may not come with the gun to shoot you, but if they evict you from your home or you lose your job, of course, it is an extremely coercive and violent process. And then, Jose, I thought of Benjamin's critique of violence in your discussion, because there the question is not so much of intentionality as it is function. So the violence that reproduces the existing laws, let's say rules, institutions, and the violence that changes them. Because in a certain sense, if you look at it as creation, let's say process of creation or production and reproduction, in that sense, by definition, you always have a violent component. There is always violence. So in that case, why do we need to have a notion of revolutionary violence? What makes that creative, let's say, form of violence so different from the other modalities of creative violence? And in that sense, we should all be for violence, you know? And maybe the question is why there's not more violence in this society? Why in this society there is not more violence, given the situation as David, for example, explained? Why not? They don't have guns to shoot the bankers and the people who come to foreclose. Why people are so servile in that sense. But why we need to have, because in a certain way I think you're presupposing that violence is a negative thing, and let's give it a more positive categorization. You know, why revolutionary and why not creative versus maintaining, let's say, or revanchist, let's say, violence.
No, I got you. And I think I like that, right? Why? Because this goes to the point you made on the first night of our discussion, is that new way of talking about this stuff, right? And yeah, that's an important. So I'm not committed to saying that we have to use that term, right? But the point is this, and I think this is sort of a phenomenal approach that I take. When I think about creative violence and a revolutionary things, I think you can see it in the world in concrete terms, and it says the last is first now, right? And so if we want to cast that as revolutionary, fine. If we want to cast it as creative, sure. But I think this needs to be staked out as something that is at least sort of clear to us what we're doing with this, right? What it's aimed towards. And again, it's not some personal thing. It's a programmatic level we're discussing. So yeah, I agree. Why do we need to? I think we need terms to discuss this in the first place, right? Because when we think about the question of violence, like I said, it's always about whether it's good or bad or not. We just take for granted what it is. Right, so presenting some sort of typology doesn't sort of help us clarify what we're dealing with, right? Because think about this, right? Like when we think about, and I teach alienation this way, it's a form of violence, right? Well, does the capitalist sit around and think like, I don't want to hurt these people? They want fucking money, right? And so on that end, you think, well, is it violence at that point in time? Because there's no intention involved, right? And so on that end, I think we need to make choices about sort of what is and isn't violence, and that's really, really important to determine what is and isn't, right?
But I thought you yourself had argued against moralizing violence.
Yeah.
And but you presupposes a moral violence.
Yeah, of course. I mean, that's what liberals do anyway. I mean, let's put it this way. I come from an Nietzschean perspective. It's like everything I'm saying presupposes values. Fine.
So then it should be part of your argument that first comes the moral judgment, and then any other discussion about it.
But would you say it's okay? I mean,
At least it would be.
Yeah, that we are for the creation of the new. We take also an ethical stand. We're not against violence. In that sense, we're in favor of violence. Not just any violence, of course,
fine.
but the creation of the new.
The issue is this: if somebody says we'll justify that.
That's why we have the guns.
I think
That's
I-
what we have
That's
to
the
do.
whole point. Is that we don't need to have that discussion. It's already
Yes,
good.
yes,
It's over,
yes.
right?
I think this
Violence.
I think this discussion might be helped by what happened during the French Revolution, whereby after non-domination has been declared as the major principle of the revolution involving liberty and their rights, but non-domination as a crucial thing, then the distinction emerged very clear between insurrectionary violence, which might be parallel to your revolutionary violence, and oppressive violence. Insurrectionary violence is normally known as terror, and all the the obfuscation of the French Revolution through this building up of terror, whereby the French Revolution is reduced to terror, but it was insurrectionary violence, which is a violence that can give rise to right with capital R, with two laws, positive laws, but to right, because contrary to oppressive violence, because obviously there is not a right to oppress, there is not a right to domination. However, there is a right which has been proclaimed there not to be dominated. And in this sense, you can see the devastating effects of addressing violence as if violence were an autonomous phenomenon. And precisely when you mention Benjamin, the crucial thing about Benjamin is his framework. The very sentence of the most commented, perhaps, analysis of violence ever is that the critique of violence is to be understood as establishing the relation between violence and the law and justice. So between institutions, violence, which is described in institutions, and justice, which has to do with the values in general that underpin the undertakings of a specific violence. So here we have this question of the consideration of violence as an autonomous phenomenon, which is an operation of the dominating classes by definition, whereby they obfuscate totally any revolutionary struggles, any insurrectionary struggles, reducing them to violence, and at the same time, hiding the oppressive violence, which takes place on a regular, everyday basis, and which most of it has become structural. So underpins our normal way of life. But this distinction between insurrectionary violence, which can bring about right, and oppressive violence, which obviously is rejected because there is no right to, I think it's crucial to your analysis in my view. Yeah.
No, I agree. And I think
And before we have any response to that, is one more question. So, Victor,
Oh, okay. Didn't want to interrupt the debate, but I also want to make a question that relates to papers. So, especially to Sergey, I really liked the way you dealt with the issue of logic versus historical in terms of temporality and reinterpreting that. I think it was an interesting alternative to how Heinrich looks at the supposedly logical method of Marx. I don't know if you did that in opposition to him, to Michael Heinrich. No, not in opposition to him. Well, it's a great critique anyway, voluntary or not. But my question is, is there a role for the ontological in your reflection, in the sense of even if capital, because you told us a story from the standpoint of capital and you try to make this logic really concrete. But even if capital wants to, let's say, emancipate itself from people with real needs, from producing use values as part of the commodity form, from concrete labor, from nature, it can't, right? So my question to you is a little bit, and that's why to relate the different papers, why does Marx lose time with all these historical chapters, let's say, in Capital, right? If this is only, let's say, how this logic becomes operational in historical terms, why does he waste so much time with it? Is there any sense to this notion of the political economy of the working class versus the political economy of capital? And how does that fit into your view? Because then my question is like, what role does the commodity form play in this? Because I have the feeling, by trying to draw every significant phenomenon in our society a direct connection to the valorization process, I don't know if if everything that's not directly connected to the valorization process is kind of an epiphenomenon. I don't know, maybe the commodity form shows you how things are not directly connected to the process of production of value or to the productive process, but still take on the logic of a capitalist logic in the sense of taking the logic of the commodity form. So, and to connect then to what you said about the new technologies, I don't know if we need to say they're producing value, to say they're fundamental to our society. These technologies, I mean, cell phones, internet, etc., are a vehicle for commodification of, relationships that capital only very indirectly affected before, maybe. And this brings me to the whole question with Ireland, because I really like this expression, to normalize an extraordinary state of affairs. And you told a little bit the story of how, in your case and in the case of the movement, you go against this normalization. But I wanted to ask you, what is it looking like on the ground now in terms of the movement that's between this situation that you described very well and analyzed very well, and the alternatives, let's say, like you suggested, from Paul Mason? What is being built in terms of movements now in Ireland? And finally, because it was very interesting, in your talk, you actually reflected the notion of history in Siarhei's talk by talking about how the 19th century is the present in many ways. How what we're living is not that new, it's just maybe an accelerated version of that process, which directly echoes the notion of history in the first paper. I've already spoken a lot, but just a question on the notion of racism, One way to connect it to the process of production of capital, it's not just that racism is based on the division between owners of the means of production and those that need to sell their labor power, and again with the Irish question, why did Marx emphasize the Irish question so much? Because these are some of the first racialized subjects within this classical example of capitalism in England. Not speak about colonialism, but just in that case, because these workers, the value of the labor power of the Irish worker was lower than of the English worker, just as you have differences with gender, which again takes us back to the question of these workers reproduce themselves, reproduce their labor power in different ways, and or they have different needs. Marx says these are like the moral, there's a moral component to how the value of the labor power is determined. And this creates divisions within the working class, which is a key dimension of racism that you can connect directly to how capitalism reproduces itself. So that would be also a way to insert racism and the Irish question directly into, I'm not saying none of this goes against what you're saying, just saying how you incorporate them. Okay, those were the thoughts.
I have a question. One thing is that I think that if you comment on Kasos, that because I want to ask you if the balance is wrong and what is wrong there, that you're going to comment on what is that. So maybe.
Do I think balance is wrong?
No, if you principle is like if we we discussed it before, like there's like a presupposition that there's like on a moral level there's something wrong with it, and I was like, I just really wanted to point out if there's something wrong, what is wrong. But I have a question.
No, that's an easy question. You have your foot on my throat, I feel entitled to kick your ass, right? And I'm perfectly justified in doing so, right? And that goes back to Carlos's point, is that, yeah, sure, we're already on board with certain types of violence being okay, and other types of violence not being okay, particularly the violence of capitalism, right? It's the issue around, and here's the thing, maybe I need to explain the discipline I come from. I hang out with philosophers, right? And they spend a lot of fucking time trying to, give their ethical argument and say, oh no, believe is bad, let's justify this. Oh no, torture's bad, let's just, forget that, right? We've already stated the position. Let's move on from that, right? And I think the more fundamental question is like, what is violence, right? And so that's what I was thinking about this, because again, that's, just stupid arguments about stuff, you're just like, I don't want to deal with this, just leave, right? So in terms of the ethics of morality, the morality of violence, I'm for sure, right? But I can certainly distinguish, at least from my perspective, right, times when it's needed and times when it's not, right? And I can, and on top of that too, I can direct the objects. I know that the objects I'm directed towards being good or bad and so on and so forth. So I hope that clarifies that a bit. Yeah.
It clarifies your position.
Oh yeah, no problem.
I have a question for you, Sergey. When you say logical time and I want you to explain more the relationship between logical time and the notion of contradiction, because then you sort of moment you speak about the logical gap and the moment in which violence takes place and strike takes place and resistance takes place, and to me it felt that is a bit of a functionalist reduction of the way in which capitalism produces. I mean, contradiction and crisis are very much normative crisis as well. I mean, why do we bail out banks? Because we cannot allow, ethically speaking, that people lose all their money. It's not just a matter of function. Capitalists can survive out of that. If you just let tons of people die in poverty, it's not a problem. I think it's just a self-understanding that we cannot allow this, because we need to keep thinking that this is the best possible system that allows people to be free and flourish. And I just wonder if your model leaves space for this like normative self-understanding of capitalism as a form of life, or if you think, no, this is bullshit, and I don't think it makes any sense at all.
Okay, first question.
Also for Sergey, it seems to me that you showed how you illustrated the dominance of logical over diet. Do you want time to respond to it?
No.
Okay. You illustrated the dominance of logical over diachronic time on three levels, right? First, on the level of the sequence of the moments in the production of surplus. Second, on the level of the sequence of crisis, revolt, restoration within a particular mode of production, namely capitalism. And finally, on the level of the sequence of the historical sequence of modes of production. On all three levels, you showed the dominance of logical over historical time. Then, logical over diachronic time. Then you related in a very interesting way this first sequence with the second sequence, showing how the interventions between the moments, that this return of the repressive diachronic time regulates this second sequence of crisis and what results from the crisis. I want to challenge you to reflect on the relation between maybe the second series and the third series, the relation, the sequence of crises and the sequence of modes of production, and also I would like to ask whether you see a return of this repressed diachronic time on these further series. So whether we can think of historical regressions, for example, or even possible revolutions within the third series.
Okay.
all these questions, Francesca Ross and Victor are related, so I'm glad I will try to respond to them. In terms of some kind of normative understanding of crisis, we must think of capitalism as the best possible system. I would answer that it is the only possible system under this ontology. So indeed, a certain ontological presupposition is there, and namely, it is a kind of ontology that has this strange logical dominance in the very material practices of everyday life. Right? So this is the ontology. There is no outside of capital. There is no alternative to capital because capital is ontology in that sense. And in fact, I agree with Tina. This is very much her ground set. Now, what about then? Why does Marx spend all this time on these particular histories? I would say that in my approach, I do not oppose necessity from contingency. Necessity and contingency are for me together. And this goes back to the question of, for example, the necessity of colonialism to capital. I would say that I bent over backwards to show this dominance of the logical, but this, what I hope to have shown by introducing logical time is that the diachronic always returns. Sometimes in form of violence, sometimes in form of class struggle, sometimes in other forms, but that is part. This is the necessary part of what I was trying to show. And that, while it appears contingent to the forms of commodity, for example, it is nonetheless necessary, I would say, because of how things coalesce. That's why, although colonialism is not inscribed in the commodity form, it is necessary insofar as this is what we have. This is what it is necessary, as it were, retroactively. So, obviously, the diachronic time, we have something like labor power that is both. Labor power, the expansion of labor power must, so the level of production as opposed to level of circulation must take place. This is one of the gaps included in the logical time. That must take place. The expansion of labor power must take place diachronically. On the other hand, labor power is sold as potentiality, so it is incarnation of this logical. So here's a perfect example, and this is why we must, in the new, and this is to a question of new technologies, in the new phenomena, or perhaps new, of capital, we must not lose sight of labor power, I think. While there is a temptation to produce new ontologies of finance capitalism, I think we need to give account of something like where in leisure we're producing surplus value. We need to still retain the concept of labor power and therefore labor theory of value for this particular reason, because this is what allows us to think the dominance of the logical, but nonetheless always the return of the diachronic, where again struggle can take place. Finally, to Ross's question, how I like how you outlined the three levels on which logical dominates. How does return of the diachronic reflect on the mode of production as they proceed? Again, I don't know, because I do think this mode of production is on the ontological level. How it can, what is the logical movement there? I'm not sure. It's just, this is the kind of system that creates its own presuppositions into its effects. So this is what I wanted to point out. Therefore, it creates the appearance that there is no alternative. So I will have to think about that.
I would like to say something to that, particularly since you referenced my argument regarding the ontology and all. My argument is not that capital equals being. Therefore, all there is kind of my argument is surplus equals B, right? So, and therefore, when you speak of an ontology that involves, as Ross rightly pointed out, but it was your argument, that it involves, transitions between different modes of production. This in itself implies that there are other modes of production.
Yes,
right?
and I would say there are other ontologies. I'm just not prepared.
They're not
I'm not prepared to make the argument.
Right, okay.
So and it's not within my parameter of my argument.
Okay, then there is a little problem.
Yes, that is something that I must reflect on, but I cannot
Yes.
now say.
Okay. So, well, if you want a comment here, if you conceive of being a surplus, then you can conceive of different modes of production that involve surplus without being capitalist.
Yeah, I understand.
Anyone like that, you or?
You were asking me about what's been built now on the ground. Well, the thing that worries me about what's been built on the ground is it really resembles the same kind of movement that was around in 1966 when there were a number of Georgian houses which have been used as tenements for 200 years, collapsing in the city centre and killing people. So they ripped a lot of these places down and moved people out of them very fast. Some of the leaders of this housing movement, because it displaced all these people. So it still wasn't as bad as it is today, actually, which is amazing. But yes, the leaders of that protest movement, arranged to basically have themselves placed in prison as a political protest. To do this. So their demands were for housing, but not for reconstruction of how we conceive of land use. And here we are again. And we'll be back here again. There are many international investors who bought up land at rock bottom prices in Ireland at the height of the crisis. And they're now making good on their returns. So there's more pain to come. And the government are completely involved in them. So what's being built on the ground is merely salve for a wound which is still very, very often festering. The biological metaphor. Marx on Ireland. Well, I think the thing I refer to, the quote I referred to, that was a speech to the German Workers' Assembly sometime after the famine. The famine actually went on for a long time. The worst year, I think, was Black 47. So that was the worst bit. But I think it went on for about a decade. And it got worse, and then it sort of slowly. But so many people had died. He talked in the same speech about Irish people being replaced with sheep. Now, the reason he made that comment was because he was looking at British government documents at the time, who were pretty sanguine about the prospect of actually having more agricultural land. So that is the kind of what's the word I'm looking for? Well, there are many words for this, but this is the kind of stuff, the kind of underbench sort of stuff. This is the way of thinking about black people and so on that existed at the time, that was very popular at the time. The French felt this way about the Jewish, there's so many examples. So that's why he said those things. And why did he talk about Ireland in particular? Because it was I guess it was nearby, and it was so awful. It was extreme. So, there weren't many people who were traveling around Ireland at the time, but those that did, there were several German commentators actually who would have written in German I can't recall the names, but there was one in particular who was very famous. And the shocking scenes they described, people dying on the side of the road, grass stains on their hands, probably familiar with it if you're thinking about it. Very upsetting stuff. The moral value of labour power in Ireland. Well, how would they have seen it at the time? They probably would have seen it through the lens of the ascendancy, who's extracted the wealth. And I don't know really, population is Surf-like. Do they still have labour power? My ignorance is probably stopping me from giving you a full answer.
Yeah, I would actually, what made me think, your made me think how is the surplus value produced there is from suffering. It's suffering becomes the vehicle of production. So it's something like, instead of labor capacity or labor power, we have something like suffering capacity or surplus suffering instead of surplus labor.
But what they got back was agricultural land for livestock in exchange for human lives. And Marx also referred to the immigrants to America sowing the seeds for revolution.
Yeah, but even, when you're talking about rising rents is considered good, that's good for investment, blah, blah, that speaks precisely that what is being exploited is, perhaps we can say, resilience of this population, its capacity to separate. Almost reminds me of production of surplus value on the addiction to drugs. So I think somebody made this argument, so I must be plagiarized here. So there is suffering capacity and surplus suffering, because then you buy drugs that produces surplus value for this, and you need it for the reproduction of your labor power. So it's kind of addiction, so pharmaceutical, and also not only with why my company is not only leisure should we think of labor.
It's commodification of suffering.
But the suffering now also is a kind of labor power. The suffering has some kind of potentiality of producing, and this is why I'm bending backwards of trying to rethink this form of commodity.
And it's worth mentioning, many didn't die, nearly starved to death, and kept going.
Well, that's precisely
it. Yeah. Affective exploitation means that you will exploit any kind of affect, from suffering to whatever you want. That's what it says. Which means you commodify affect.
Any other responses? Oh, sorry. You want to add something? No? Was there anyone to add questions? No? Okay. Anybody else? We have some time.
Yeah, technically, it's 2:10.
15 minutes.
But okay, I'll add. So you don't just commodify affect. You don't commodify suffering in the way you commodify. This is a commodity. For some reason, affect becomes commodity like labor. Like labor. But why? That's strange, right? So it's commodified in a different way than other commodities.
It's affective exploitation. It's affective commodification. That's like.
So we have to distinguish categorically affective exploitation, affective commodification, and put labor power on that side versus all other commodification. I guess that's what I'm saying. Because this affective commodification allows to produce value, whereas
Whereas the other does what? I think on the contrary, the idea is not to allow the separation of the two, not to assume that one can have economic exploitation without having the affective, and vice versa.
What is the other contribution? Now it's not. What do you mean?
Economic, purely economic.
no, where the congealed labor determines the commodity.
No, I think on the other side of each other. So it's like, I think so. I don't know. We have to see.
Also, to Ross's question, just quickly, since we have 1 minute left, what I should have said, the other modes of production persist under capitalism, but they're not dominant. So
Yeah.
that I should have said that they.
That speaks to the synchronicity.
Yeah, that's obvious. Obviously, you can have levers and fishers exchanging things that persist and that not persist, but it's just not determined. So
Can I ask a brief question? Do you think that the capitalism is a ethical moral free
Say that again.
Is an ethical moral free space or not? I mean,
morally free.
ethically, if you understand, really depends what you understand about that. It's without ethical judgment or moral judgment, it's free from it. More detail, some of that.
History is not understood the subject.
Can you repeat also the question? Can you also repeat that question? Because it's going back to
Is capitalism an ethically or morally free space?
Oh, morally free space.
Meaning a logic that doesn't involve ethical judgments.
Yeah.
And he responds yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Maybe I can add one question.
Whereas the other two, their papers, presupposes that it is not. Because for them, history is a subject. And if history is a subject makes moral judgment. fundamental difference between these two arguments.
I don't understand, what makes us, I'm gonna go back with, what makes, can you explain to me what makes a subject? History a subject or no subject?
First of all, you say there is...
Give me 1 to 3.
There is intention in history.
Yes, I heard that.
Who has intention? Only
Or
scientists.
direction.
No, I understand.
Yeah, or teleology.
Is there anything else that makes a subject other than the intention?
Oh, for example, moral judgment.
Okay.
Well,
What happens depends how you instrumentalize it.
how you instrumentalize what?
Capitalism.
No, she's asking what constitutes a subject.
Oh, sorry, I'm still.
No, I heard all of those and I'm trying to put them to make the list. See what I'm trying to do.
Right.
So it's the
You
moral.
would even say consciousness, right? With the consciousness, there is intention, there is moral judgment.
Anything else?
Some might say a body.
Some might say what?
A body?
Yeah.
And so what?
Hegel would get rid of it. But somebody else would
So
say...
when do we see this in the body in history, like?
Well, Hegel sees the body there too, but at the end of the history, the body disappears and all we have is
Napoleon.
Napoleon, that's right.
The universal on horseback.
With Hegel as the philosopher.
Right in the finish.
Would you like to contribute one more comment regarding state violence? I mean, we had a little bit of discussion regarding like revolutionary violence, but how about when the revolution is complete, successful revolution? What do you do with state violence? The state is the control of the means of violence.
No, I thought about that a little bit. So part of me thinks of something like the Zapatistas, right? So these are then never on the king first, right?
We eventually like do away with the state by definition.
Yeah. But I mean, at this point in time, where they're at is self-defense, right? And so in some sense, it sort of depends on the context that you're in, right? So what I mean to say by that is something like this, is that, okay, the revolution happens, right? There's no more capitalism, right? I mean, that's idealistic in many ways, right? But let's imagine there's other competing things that you have to defend yourself from, right? So I guess...
But we have had like a revolutionary government, right? Or
What's that mean, though?
I mean, after, let's say, the completion of the revolution, like for how long have you known being like in defense, let's say, Cuban revolution and Cuban state after that?
How long
Don't
that
talk about
exists, you
Russia.
gotta defend yourself from it. You know what I mean?
Okay, so that's what I'm asking, so that's what I'm asking here.
Yeah, so in terms of revolution, it's self-defense. That's what I would say. And I mean, you just look at those Zapatistas, that's exactly what they're doing. They're defending their way of life against this capitalist world that's encroaching on their life.
Okay.
Right?
Can we say the same about the Soviet Union? Can we say the same about other regimes that they?
Now, you know, you couldn't say that about every regime. It's sort of like I'm torn with the idea of Venezuela right now. Because I mean, you think about what Chavez had. He had the means to, institute a revolution, right? Probably left up by just picking his predecessor, right? And so there's all these other problems that come along with it, right? But I guess to fall back on, maybe it's not the best answer, right? That needs to be a part of the program in terms of understanding what you use this instrument for, right? It needs to be very clear. I think that's really the issue here, right? And that's why I spend so much time on, what is that? What is violence actually, right? Because, we'll put it this way, many of us are just throwing around the term, right? But it's really, really important to make these distinctions because of this issue right here, right? And I think, thinking about this, especially in terms of Frantz Fanon, we read the first chapter of what is it, Reproduction of the Earth, and he's giving this nice description of the colonial world and sort of how violence is informed, right? Well, he spends the rest of the Reproduction of the Earth trying to figure out, how do we mobilize this in a way without repeating what these people have done to us, right? And that's really the big key of this, and I think that's really the root of your question, right? So,
I think the case of the Soviet Union provides an interesting example because there are two, obviously they ask themselves this question, so very central throughout the 20s, and there are two answers basically. One, after 1917, there is violence that continues, is still revolutionary violence because revolution is not yet completed until communism comes. And then around 1927-28, with the introduction of socialism in one country, it becomes self-defense. So with Stalinism, with his thesis that the closer we're to communism, the more internal enemies are, or the more dangerous they are, then it becomes self-defense. So they have precisely these two levels, even though the state was already established.
Well, I have a comment on violence. I think that the difficulty is that during the struggles there is a constant call from the other side, from media, from everybody to denounce violence from wherever it comes from. And our spontaneous reaction is, fuck it, we don't. But there is the next step. How can we combine this kind of position with a necessary discussion inside the movement about which violence, how to organize, there are certain practices that are outside an ethical perspective of the left. This kind of discussion is a difficult discussion because which is the criterion? Because it cannot be a general abstract criterion. It is always concrete in concrete situations. Ben Said has in a very interesting chapter that is titled "Restrained Violence," is elaborating on a culture of dominated violence. But again, even if we try to cultivate a culture of dominated violence, what does it mean in concrete situations? That's something that is.
What do you mean by cultivate violence, right? You're Greek, right? Did you serve in the military?
I didn't hear.
You're a Greek person, right?
If you have served.
Did you serve in the military?
Yeah.
You know how to shoot a gun, right?
Yeah.
That's kind of comprising.
No, we don't learn this in the Greek army.
Oh, okay, well, I'm assuming it's so, right?
Why?
That's sort of the point, though. It's like in terms of concretizing, in terms of the sort of concrete value of this stuff, it's like, I guess I tell my students something like this, right? I guess we could have internal discussions about what it is, what's good violence and bad violence, right? And again, I don't like really talking about that stuff, right? The other issue is just sort of mobilizing people to use violence. So if we do get a moment and we do have a program, they know what they're doing with this and it's directed properly. I tell my students, you don't gotta own a gun, you need to go learn how to shoot a gun. So join the Chelsea Gun Club or something like that, right? Because it's a tool to use, right? And if we think very, very instrumentally about this, all of a sudden it's like, oh, we're gonna use this tool in a certain way, just like we use a hammer in a certain way, right? And so I guess milling it out over like, well, is this a justified use of violence here? Is this internal? Is this okay, right? I guess we could sort that out. Right? But the bigger issue is this, and I think this is really important. We live in the United States, and I come from the state of Oregon. Outside of where my family grew up, right, everybody's armed to the teeth, and they're all right-wingers, right? So they've already sorted out that discussion, right? So on our end, I think we need to mobilize in some sense to realize that they already are ready to wipe us out. And that's the way I sort of look at this, right? And so in some sense, it's sort of urgent on my part, right? But then on the other hand, I don't want to deny that those questions are important, right? But I think they're sort of secondary to what's already going on. And it's Peter's point. Violence is already good. It's already justified. It's already around us, right? So I don't know if that answers your question, right? But I do think maybe it sort of highlights the perspective that I'm coming from.
I totally agree.
Okay.
I just want it's something that we always discuss. How to make this kind of separations, but I agree, it's a matter also of priority.
Yeah.
I have a second question for Sergei. It's partly building on Victor's question about ontology and your answer. Lukács makes in his later work an interesting distinction between organic, inorganic, and social being, and elaborates on the ontology of the social being. And this thing, this idea means something about nature and material practices. How is this formulation plays out in your argument about the logical dominance?
I need to look at Lukács. I'm sorry, it's not at the tip of my tongue right now, the late Lukács. But you tell me more
Yeah, of course. It was just about ontology.
It's a distinction that Hegel introduced. It differentiates.
Social being versus natural.
Yes, but Hegel himself, Cosette, for example, trusts this argument.
Yeah.
But Lukács doesn't. Lukács is.
Oh, I see your question now.
Yeah.
We were with the question of resilience and naturalization of naturalization metaphors of effects of capital. We were talking about that natural disasters are never natural because they are always already social, because they can social effect, they intervene in social structures and so on. In that sense, I don't see a separation. It would separate the two, and the yesterday's talk is actually an exemplary for that.
Right, yeah, exactly. Yeah. Is that what you have in mind? Like Hegel said, the dialectic, everything's dialectic, but only social being is involved in a dialectic, not the natural being.
No, the distinction is capital needs nature, but nature can continue to exist without capital. So capital creates a social, it has an ontology in the sense of the society creates a reality.
Well, we'll see if nature will be left over after capital.
Planet Earth will survive. Planet Earth will survive. The universe will survive.
Then it will be perhaps natural in a different way. Now we don't have access to this way. Now all of nature, I think all of nature is inexplicable from the logical dominance of capital. That's what I would say.
Okay, that's okay. I disagree with that.
Okay, I guess we can conclude and continue with the lecture. Thank you all very much.